Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Awesome. So I'm a terrible podium speaker, so I hope I don't mess up, and I'll be really quick in terms of in this presentation, and we'll go from there. As the introduction said, I'm here to talk about the political promise of India's youth, but before we kind of get into the discussion, I think I wanted to give a little bit of context. So I'll be super brief. Not too many numbers, but still important enough, and I think this audience will know most of these numbers in that way. Here's a big chart. We have about 800 seats, MPs, in the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, specifically 543 in the Lok Sabha, 245. As of June of 2023, we have 0 member of parliamentarians below the age of 30. Why does that matter? If you look at the bottom numbers, 65% of this country is below the age of 29, according to the 2011 census. The UN Population Fund actually increases that number to about 71, but we don't have that data from the census itself because it hasn't released. Again, in terms of representation in parliament, 0%. The average age of an Indian today is 28.4. In the Lok Sabha, the age of a representative is 61. In the Rajya Sabha, it's 64. And the largest number, though, that I'm really interested in is the last one. There are 67 crore people below the age of 25, or 670 million people. And again, 0, not just in the parliament, but in any assembly across India. Now, really focusing on that 67 crore number, I'm fascinated by that, the 670 million people. If we just take, let's say, the most populous countries in the world, right? China, as you obviously know, India, the 3rd most populous country happens to be the United States with 330 million. Just in India alone, between the ages of 0 and 25, below the age of 25, there are double the entire population, which is a huge number. And yet, this demographic has 0 representation. Now, if you think about the United States, there are upwards of 890 state legislatures, representatives at states, and all across to the House of Representatives below the age of 25 across different states, whether it's from California to even Alabama. So I'm just giving you comparisons in that way that this is not necessarily the norm that we have, where we have 0 representatives below the age of 25. Because of those numbers, you've heard of India being described as a democracy. Some people will call it an autocracy. People will call it a client state, bureaucratic state, etc. Because of these numbers, I want to introduce you to a new term, probably not introducing to most of you, is a gerontocracy. That's a very complicated way of saying a state or society that's run by old people, where the majority of the demographic is young. Now, gerontocracy, again, it's a French kind of term, post the French Revolution, when the representatives, again, were 60-65, this term and this kind of concept came into fruition, Latin terms, etc. Now, has India always been a gerontocracy? And in the book, that's what I start exploring is, okay, the data says that we are a gerontocracy through and through, but have we always been a gerontocracy? In my research, no, that's not the case. But why are we a gerontocracy? I talk about ageism. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of ageism, academically studied it, but since the 70s, ageism has been studied from kind of the other alternative aspect, right? So when you turn old, how are you discriminated against by state or society? Very few people until 2018, 2017 actually started studying ageism through the perspective of what's the discrimination you face when you're young? How is state or society prejudiced against you, discriminatory against you when you're a young person? And it doesn't have to be anything too intense, but even casual remarks of ageism. When I'm in kind of colleges giving talks, I ask people, how many of you have been told that, by someone elderly, apna kam se kam rakho, right? Or what do you know, you're still a kid. These are very casual forms of ageism. Now, what I try to explore in the book is, again, were we always ageist? Were we always a gerontocracy? I find, no, the reality is not in him. These are just some names and people that I'm highlighting, but I go across about 45, I think, freedom fighters, etc., who are actually all below the age of 25. But here are just some examples that you all know of. Bhagat Singh at the age of 21. now B.R. Ambedkar, was nominated to the Bombay Legislative Council at the age of 25. Just literally, like, I think it was a month post he turned 25. Rani Lakshmibai was 21. Swami Vivekananda, when he went to speak at the World Parliament of Religion, was 25 years of age. Now, one of the things that I always think about is how different our state, society, someone's culture, someone's religion would be so different if these sort of people had listened to those people that were saying, that you're too young to be doing this. In fact, there's actually a recorded correspondence between Swami Vivekananda and a few kind of religious leaders at that time who wrote to Swami Vivekananda saying that he shouldn't be going to the World Parliament of Religion because he was too young to represent Hinduism. And I put that in this context. Now we're celebrating Swami Vivekananda's National Youth Day. We talk about World Parliament of Religion like it's something that was just there. But even at that time, there's correspondence, and you'll see that throughout the book as well, of a lot of people during the time saying that you're too young, too inexperienced, too immature, and basing and discriminating on the basis of age. Another kind of historical aspect that I think we'll cover in the discussion as well is the 61st Amendment, which was brought by Rajiv Gandhi in the late 80s, which basically brought down the age from 21 to 18. India was one of the actual last few democracies, the last being Switzerland, but the second or third last, in which we decreased the age from 21 to 18. And even during that time, there were thousands of protests that erupted for and against, by the way, against the 61st Amendment. So people trying to say, no, this isn't a good deal or a good thing, and people obviously advocating and supporting it. Enough of history, though. What I also talk about in the book is kind of the crisis of representation. And I argue that with so many young people that kind of make up India's society, we have very, very limited representatives who understand us. It's another discussion to be had if they can, or do you have to be young to represent us? I would say yes. I'm a very big advocate for that, but obviously I understand the criticism behind it. One thing that I do and look at in the book as well is the 17th Lok Sabha was the oldest Lok Sabha elected by the youngest electorate ever. And we basically went back all the way and kind of tallied up the average ages from the first Lok Sabha in 1951 and 1952 all the way until the 17th. And what you see is the average age was around 42 to 44 in basically Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha when the first Lok Sabha elections that happened. And what then you see is basically a increase of 2 decades. So like I said, the average age is 61 and 64. Why does that matter? First and foremost, I think you've heard of it, basically there's a lack of representation, but the contribution is so great. 34% of the gross national income is contributed by people between the ages of 15 and 29. This is not my number, this is the government of India. And like I said, in 2023, in the 17th Lok Sabha, post-June, there have been 0 representation of people below the age of 30. We're made to believe that India's youth are its future. You hear that a lot, the demographic dividend, all these things that are happening, but what's the current reality? I think India's youth aren't doing the greatest, and it's just not me. The data speaks for itself. So for example, I don't know if you've heard of this index called the Youth Development Index created by the Commonwealth Youth Program. They take about 181 countries. They use about 27 indicators from illiteracy to malnutrition to things like even the World Happiness Report, etc. And they judge all how young people are doing. And it turns out that India is in the bottom third of all the countries that they measure. Why does that matter though? So the countries that we kind of want to be or envision ourselves or we compare ourselves to, whether it's a Singapore, a Germany, a US, they all kind of feature in the top 1/3 of the rankings, right, in the Youth Development Index. But when we feature in the rankings, we're actually lower than all our counterparts, South Asian regions for sure. Nepal is at 94, etc. Who are we next to? States like Sudan, Syria, and Iraq who have been in midst of civil wars. So we're doing better than them, but ever so lightly in that case. Just more data. I get it, people don't really trust international figures. You'll trust the government of India, and the NSSO survey says that 33% of India's youth are neither are untrained, are illiterate, or unemployed. So basically the world's largest youth demographic has 33% of young people who are neither studying or literate, they're not working, and they're neither trained either. Other things that you've probably heard of, India has the highest youth suicide rates, as well as the World Happiness Report Index that we feature very lowly on. So again, India's youth aren't doing the greatest, but in the book, I talk and discuss this, and I'm sorry, my presentations are very Gen Z focused, and we love emojis. We basically say one of the biggest things that we've gotten as feedback, it's because India's youth are not political. I strongly disagree with that. I do think India's youth are very political, but political in different forms, and also, as you'll see later on, political where they're allowed to be. So what do I mean by that? Everything we do, whether it's the songs that we prefer, the dances we do, the social media usage we have, are all some form of politics. And there's been a lot of persecution against young people, and it's something that I actually discuss in the book as well. So where they actually speaking their mind online is a very, very big concentration. But also when people say, oh, when it comes to voting, in the 2019 Lok Sabha, we had 8.4 crore voters, or 84 million, which is the population of the entirety of Germany that came out to vote for the first time. Those are huge numbers, and all for the first time. If not that, just not voting, the last aspect is you have so many young people contesting. And please remember this name, Arya Ranjendran, who was 21 years old when she was elected as mayor of Trivandrum in Kerala. At the age of 21, she basically has a budget of over 10,000 crore rupees and about 7,000 administrative workforce to make sure that Trivandrum is running. But young people are running wherever they're allowed to, wherever they do not have a legal disenfranchisement. So what's my thesis? In this book, two things. You can't contest, that's why young people are not participating, and you can't vote. And what do I mean by that? So first thing is I talk about our kind of this legal disenfranchisement that young people have constitutionally, that there's a minimum age to contest at 25 and 30, and I'll just highlight that really specifically. If you look at the age of candidacies across India in different forms, they're quite inconsistent. The biggest kind of feedback that I got is, why is it 25 and 30? No one had really a scientific rationale, by the way. And in the discussion, we'll go into, why did our Constituent Assembly really decide on 25 and 30? There was no scientific rationale at all. And that's not me saying it, it's them saying it themselves. But if you look at it even now, right? At 16 and a half, you're eligible to join the army, which means that you're mature and experienced enough, according to these laws, to carry a gun and go defend India's borders. But you're not allowed to represent your own people in the halls of parliament or assemblies. But it doesn't stop there, because from between the ages of 16 and a half to 21, you can basically do anything in India, right? All the way until, if you want to become a UPSC officer, an IS, IPS, IFS officer, you can take the test at 21. I have a friend, two friends actually, who took it just shy of 21 and were able to become an SDM after 6 months of training. What does that mean? You're literally in, you're representing an entire, not representing, but controlling an entire district at 21 and a half years old. I know them. And this is across the case, and it's very, very common in this case. Judges now can become judges at the age of 21, take a test, and they have very limited training, right? So we've had several examples in North India where you have judges basically ruling on the rule of law at the age of 21 as well. The only thing that you can't, and by the way, I spoke about Ayurveda before, at a local level, so at a panchayati, sarpanch, municipality, mayor, and councillors, you have to be 21. So in some cases, what happens is you can technically be a prime minister, right? But you can't still become an MLC in some states. They're very inconsistent in that way. Technically, I mean, you can, right, legally. But that's something that I really explore, the inconsistencies in that way, and was there a scientific rationale? I also try to look into what would be the impact of decreasing the age. Will we actually have young people that come into political office? Something that I really think is interesting. So the yellow are basically states that are developed, that we try to be like, whether it's the US, whether it's the UK, Germany, Switzerland, etc. One thing consistent among them, right, is the age of 18. When you can vote, you can contest. Now, if you look at countries that are developing but with similar demographics, an Indonesia, a Kenya, a Brazil, their ages are 21. The only country that has, unfortunately, the highest youth demographic, but also the highest age of candidacy is India. not the only one. We're similar to North Korea in that way. The other thing is you can't vote. And I don't mean that literally you can't vote. Obviously you have the right, but there are systems and barriers that get in the way. And I look in and explore a lot of that. So for example, in 2024, there are 64 elections that are taking place, out of which everyone has been saying that the youth will be consequential to all of them, but one specific country has the largest youth vote bank, which is India, 21.6 crore. 210 million, roughly, young people between the ages of 18 and 29 will be coming out to vote in the general elections. That is the largest vote bank in the history of the world, by far, of one certain demographic. Now, why, and something that I really explore as well, is think about how consequential this youth vote bank is, because it's very hard to kind of visualize 210 million or 21 crore youth voters. So I just wanted to give you this little comparison. So you have probably heard of the DUSU elections, Delhi University Student Unions, a little bit. I know that Karnataka has, the student elections are not allowed, but they're basically, in 2019, there were 1.3 lakh people between the ages of 18 and 25 who came out to vote in the DUSU elections. 1.3 lakh students, right? And this is only in one part of DUSU, the North Campus, correct? Out of which the winning candidate got 52,000 votes. That was the winning president of DUSU elections in 2019. Now, stick with me here. This is, I love thinking about this. So North Campus comes under the assembly constituency of Timarpur, right? In Delhi Assembly, the constituency is Timarpur, right? And in that, the MLA that won had 25,000 votes. 25,000 votes, the Aam Aadmi Party candidate that won. Again, 1.3 lakh students came out to vote in that same constituency, right? And the winner of the MLA seat that has constitutional authority won with 25,000 votes. Think about how consequential the youth vote can be. And this is just one example. In the book, I researched and found out that there are about 30 different parliamentary seats and about 400 assembly seats that can have a youth vote that can actually decide by much who will actually contest and win if they're allowed to vote. Now, what do I mean by allowed to vote? Of course you're allowed to vote. But there are 9 crore or 90 million, roughly again, the entire state of Germany, of 18 to 29-year-olds that are not registered to vote. Now, commentators will say, oh, it's because they're not interested. So we already have 210 people between the ages, 210 million people, I'm sorry, 21 crore people, who are already coming out to vote. But because we have this number, which is by far really, really large too, we see a lot of people saying, oh, they're not interested. What I look into the book and I realize is that's not the case. Again, young people are registered, but why are we so interested in everything else? It's because it's accessible. You know, I know Raghav Chadda because he's married to Parneeti Chopra. You know why I know that? Because it was all over my Instagram. No, genuinely, it was everywhere, right? It's so accessible to me. Now, when we talk about this 90 million number, why does it exist? There are two things. One is when we talk about the migrant vote, we never think about and count students in that migrant vote, but they're very much part of the migrant vote, and also young professionals. And that is what makes up the 90 million number, and this is not me, this is the ECI saying it. Now within that, there are measures, because the Election Commission of India actually wants the student to vote. The Election Commission of India actually realizes that it's unfair that a student has to choose between either their right to civic duty or their education / their workplace when they graduate. That's not what they want. In fact, they actually came out with this, Annexure 4.1, which is basically all you need is if you are registered to vote, or even if you're a first-time voter, right? But you come and study in, let's say, St. Joseph's College, but you're from Delhi. The Election Commission of India says that if you're here, then you can vote in the St. Joseph constituency that's there, or wherever your postal administration is. And all you need is not all these paperwork, but your university registrar to verify that you study there. That's it. But not a lot of people know that. Students themselves are not aware, even to the degree the chief electoral officers of different states are not aware or do not promote it enough. And that is why I believe there's a huge number of young people and students that are not registered to vote. Again, the process of re-registration, etc., these are all these things. And in the book, I talk about, what if these barriers were broken down. I believe, 21.5 crore people will actually come out to vote and be really consequential. I explore how a lot of political parties are now catering to that vote because they understand how big it is. If you include the 9 crore also, that's about 300 million or 30 crore voters that have the potential. And so we can go into further details in the talks as well, but I guess that's enough for me on this side. So should we...
All right. Thank you so much, Sudhanshu, for that talk. When I was asked to be the moderator for this session, the pitch was, hey, we need someone who's young to be the moderator. And after reading Sudhanshu's book, he's very emphatic that young, the cutoff internationally is 25. In India, it is 29. So I clearly do not qualify as young.
It's okay. I only have a year left, too. I'm counting down.
But as someone who just went through the book over the past few days, it's certainly a call to action for us as a country. It just shows us some of these statistics about, in a way, how unfairly the youth are treated, how little political representation they have because of these systemic barriers that many of us actually don't think about. So I would definitely encourage all of you here to give this book a read. It's a very easy read, while at the same time packing in a lot of data, a lot of graphs, etc., but which will make the point about both the kind of history that we'll go into a little bit here today, but also the implications of what happens when you don't give that political representation to a very large demographic. But let me start with a theme which actually comes fairly late in your book, which is this kind of pursuit for meaning and happiness among today's youth, right? And you make the point, and you made that in your presentation as well, that India's youth aren't doing all that great, that there are fairly high levels of depression, there's high level of even kind of tendencies to self-harm, there's less optimism. Can you talk a little bit about what do you think causes that kind of disquiet among India's youth today?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is quite simple, the lack of identity. And the answer is simple, but let me just kind of expound on that. But, when I was writing this, and especially the last part about the happiness aspect and the lack of identity, there was this one stark kind of report that came out. Do you remember when Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh was kind of sentenced to almost life in jail, and now it's been, decreased to like 10 years or something, and paroles. But when Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh was first sentenced to jail, there was a lot of protests that happened in North India, specifically Haryana, Punjab, and the outskirts of Delhi. In those protests, there was a lot of government property that was destroyed. Thankfully, no one was harmed. People were injured, including government employees. So the Haryana government, the Punjab government, and no Delhi, there was no FIRs there, put FIRs to about 1,200 people, out of whom 85% were below the age of 35. Now that's kind of ridiculous to me. And I thought it was like a one-time thing. And these are not my numbers. This was like reported, right? And then I started looking at the other protests that were occurring, and specifically it was in North India because, I'm North Indian, it's easier for me to understand when protests are happening. So when there was this Jat agitation that occurred, the FIRs that were placed there, there's one reoccurring theme, and that is that most of the people out on the streets happen to be young. Now, if it's an unemployment issue, kind of like the Jat agitation, etc., I get it. Right? I mean, unemployment is on record highs, like we talked about, 33%. That's the government itself that's saying that. But what was really interesting is that when it came to cultural, religious connotations, and also caste, it was the young people that were out on the streets, and they were the ones that, were taking violent means, and also obviously being, there were repercussions for that. And I think that got me into this kind of loop of thinking about why are we falling back to these identities that were given to us? I mean, we're supposed to be, the world's largest youth demographic, the labor force, and this demographic dividend, all these really sexy things are said about young people in India. But unfortunately, the reality, not just those statistics, but I've realized through my work is specifically India's Gen Z is very extremist, whether it's the left or the right. They're less moderate
than we think. And I think the direct causation of that is because we have a lack of identity. And in the book, I talked to this person, and we'll get into that, but someone basically who kind of left the country, right? And they kind of were like, we don't have an identity at home. I'm not educated, I don't have land. Because I don't have either of those, I can't marry or provide a job. And in my village, I have no respect. So I claim onto these identities, and I've seen it many, many times in my work, where I claim onto the identities that were given to me, whether it's my caste, whether it's this religious baba, whether it's the religion itself, and you see that. So I think there's a direct kind of correlation in that way, and I think that's what really got me into the loop of really figuring it out.
And of course, your book takes a particular aspect of that, the kind of political identity of the youth and their political participation, etc. But before we get into the details and the weeds of kind of the political side of things, what apart from kind of the political lack of representation and voice do you think contributes to this lack of identity that the youth is experiencing?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the shortcomings in my book and also my research. I'll be completely honest, is I really look through the perspective of age and politics. And that is something that I I willingly went in because A, there's a lack of research on this, right? When you hear and discuss about young people, the number one issue will always be unemployment, which is very necessary to be able to talk about. You will have people from Raghuram Rajan to the Prime Minister to the leader of the opposition, all fixating on one single issue. Unemployment, unemployment, unemployment. And I'm not saying that it's not important. What I am saying is that, and what's something that I really wanted to explore in this book is, look, that is one of the effects, I feel. But the larger kind of issue here, in my perspective, right or wrong, is that the lack of representation creates a lack of cohesive policy and measures and the implementation of that policy to be able to really needfully provide to this youth demographic. And I believe, and I'm not an economist, but I am a strong advocate, so I'm 100% biased, is that I think if you're able to get better representation, you will create better policy and the implementation of it as well. And maybe solve these other variety of issues. Now, if generically, of course, I do think that, unemployment is a big issue. But more than that, I have seen that identity is like a very, very big issue. And a source of unhappiness and happiness, a source of all these kind of extremist tendencies that we have. How do you solve for that? That's a very complicated kind of question.
Cool. With that context in place, let's kind of start unpacking some of the themes that you bring up in your book. And one recurring theme, obviously, is ageism. And it's obviously not just a political thing, right? Even I think a lot of young people in the corporate world or in academia, I guess, get taken less seriously because they're seen to be young, and people are like, why don't you get more experience before you speak about these issues, etc. So obviously, ageism is pervasive across the board. But at the same time, I think one of the arguments you make is that while we have young people in political and public life a lot more in the West, we probably haven't done so, at least in political life here in India. Do you think there's something uniquely Indian about our culture, our society, etc., that makes ageism more pervasive and more difficult to change and challenge here in India?
So I'm going to answer that, but going back to kind of like the first aspect that you had, I actually think that it's not just politics. I think it's only politics where we discriminate on the basis of age. And what do I mean by that? You'll hear actors and actresses doing really well at a young age. And then, even now they're like, oh, you could have been that, right? Someone goes into the Olympics, you could have been that. And especially when I'm in these talks and I advocate for decreasing the age and, the uncles and aunties and even the young people will be like, what about education? Education apparently is the only thing that discriminates between good and evil to someone in politics. But what about outside of it? So, Ritesh Agarwal dropped out of high school to create Oyo. But we're never talking about, because he became a billionaire. But we're not talking about his education. We're not talking about Neeraj Chopra, who still hasn't gotten his college degree because he was really passionate about, javelin throwing, etc. And he won the Olympics there. We're not, and I know this sounds very counterintuitive, but it's something that I find really interesting, that the realm of representation, and I actively don't use the word politics because of the negative connotations that it comes with. I talk about representation, and maybe that's just rhetoric and etc. But I believe in this. Is that when it comes to representation, we really judge and discriminate on the basis of age, especially, they'll lack this, they'll lack that. But when it comes to any other field, we're pretty proponent of them doing, I'm sure education is a big thing, but it's not like, they dropped out, they did this or that. We don't tend of it as a negative thing. Just now, I think we had two 19-year-olds who became, their founder was a unicorn. And they were IIT Delhi and Stanford dropouts. And everyone's like, yeah, dropout kiya. Right? But no one's talking about Ravinder Singh Bhatti, who also couldn't basically complete his Jodhpur master's degree because he wanted to become an MLA, which he did as an independent from Rajasthan in the Rajasthan Assembly elections. That means he's uneducated, which I think is really interesting, and I think there's the bias. To your second part of the question, I was ranting, I forgot, but I think you're talking about, was it uniquely Indian in terms of ageism? I think it's fascinating. I think it's not that India is uniquely ageist. It's that our society in general, and it's not actually just, the people that are being ageist, is what's the pushback to it? So what do I mean by that? I don't think America is any better. America is also ageist. It's also a very thriving gerontocracy. Now, if you look at the numbers, the top leadership of America is very, very old. But when you look at the senators, the House of Representatives, but then also if you get into the state houses, etc., they turn out to be quite younger, 2 decades almost younger at an average level. It's the inverse in India, first of all, right? The top leadership, when I'm talking about the prime minister, I'm talking about even the president, etc., the top leadership is comparatively and historically very young. But when it comes to the average age of an MP, MLA assemblies, it's always above 61, 62. So that's one big distinction. But the thing that you see in America is that you have a very, very active youth civic life. For example, a Taylor Swift, a Harry Styles will stop their concerts midway and ask, have you voted? And then they will have voter registration desks in their concerts that are being attended by all these, Swifties and Harry Styles fans, etc. And this is across the board, right? Robert Downey Jr. will get on a television show or whatever and say, vote the orange man out in that way. They're willing to take those risks. They're willing to kind of get out there. And look, there are many, many things wrong with America, but I'm just saying that's a proactive life. Just as a counter, I came here, I run this organization called Young India Foundation. I wanted to implement those same themes. So I reached out to about 5-10 different kind of actors, influencers that I thought would be really, really impactful. There's one rapper, I'm not going to name names, but very, very, their songs are very, very provocative in terms of, the unjust state, corruption, the inequality, etc. So I was like, they're doing a concert, and I was like, can we, partner and get voters registered? And I showed them the Taylor Swift example, etc. And by the way, Taylor Swift a month ago put on Instagram and all her social media, because they were the equivalent of panchayat elections from the village that she comes, not village, but a small town near Nashville that comes from. And she was like, hey, Nashville is going, in Tennessee is having these elections, right? And imagine, that much, can you imagine that big of an actor talking about panchayati level elections in India? Probably not as much, right? The only thing we see our actors and et cetera doing is on the day of voting, they point up their fingers and say, I voted, have you? Which doesn't really have an impact because we don't have same day voting, et cetera, right? So there's not that civic culture. But last thing is, so I reached out to one of these, and actually I reached out to many, but this one example. The person says, oh yeah, you guys are doing great. 60 lakh rupees. Everything is commercial. And I was confused, and I talked to the manager. I was like, but your songs are just this. And they're like, nahi, nahi, wo nahi, right? And so I think that is also missing. We're talking, but there's no proactive kind of civic life that's kind of fighting, not against, but fighting to kind of fix that gerontocracy. Yeah.
Excuse me, what was that 60 lakh? I couldn't get it.
He wanted 60 lakh rupees for us to register voters in his concerts.
Another very interesting aspect that I found in your book was that you spoke about how the voting like obviously what is the right voting age or even age of contesting is not something that's been fixed, right? Every country has evolved over over many centuries and reduced it and got more young people into politics. But in India, as you kind of talk about the 61st Amendment, you talk about how it was almost kind of led by a lot of protests, a lot of state level innovation. There's a great level of policy inertia. And if you see the age at which you can actually become an MP in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, that has actually not been changed since independence, whereas other countries have been able to do that. So do you think that there is, especially in the context of the 61st Amendment, a high degree of policy inertia in India, and how do you overcome that policy inertia to reduce these numbers?
So actually one thing I want to kind of fixate on is, since we're sitting in Karnataka, Karnataka was the first state to actually decrease the age at which you could vote. From 21 to 18, and they did so 4 years before the national vote came down. So Karnataka is a front leader in that, and it was because of the active civic / the political class. So Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and then West Bengal were the 4 states that, before even the bill was introduced in Parliament, in the panchayati level, in the municipalities, people were voting at the age of 18. So this specific state in itself were the first time. So you're talking about the lack of kind of policy in making sure that there.
Why have other countries been able to reduce their voting age and age of contesting, whereas India hasn't necessarily been as successful in doing so?
So I don't think, first of all, again, there has been that movement. So we have had youth movements. The student political life has been very, very strong. Even if they, I believe, don't have much, factually they don't have constitutional authority, but they just don't have much authority in itself, right? One of the things I tried to explore in the book is that these youth movements and student movements ended up becoming about the individuals. So if you look back, whether it's the JP Andolan, right? Whether it's even before that, the linguistic kind of protests, etc., wherever there were students that were coming out, and you see this a lot in the Northeast as well, where you had a lot of students coming out to protest, whether it's creating borders. The end product may or not have been successful in terms of the mission. But what it did is it kickstarted, 1 or 2 people's political lives in every respective movement. And so that's something that I actually do explore, is that there's been no lack of student / youth movements and, that political inertia to be able to kind of get what you want, whether it's quota reservations, whether it's linguistic identities, whether it's, statehood, et cetera, throughout the course of history, pre-independence and post. But what's very peculiar here is that instead of the movement accomplishing what it set out to do, you brought out a class of leadership. And that leadership has been going on until now. And I'm talking about from literally the 50s and 60s all the way until now. So many people can trace their roots back to that political student movement. And I think when I did some case studies in the book with the UK, with the US, and one of the starkest responses, so for example, in the US, they have brought the age down. In the UK, they brought the age down to which you can vote or contest about 5 times in history post-1947. So they started also off with 25 and 30, and I think we'll get into the 61st Amendment in the later questions, but basically they've brought it down many, many times. Now, I feel like if it was in India, there would be a face attached to it. And in my experience, so we're also trying to advocate for decreasing the age. I have lobbied with over 125 MPs. The ones that have agreed have all wanted to become the face. They're like, hum private members bill karenge. They'll introduce a private members bill. Now, historically in India, only 1 private members bill has passed. Every single session, they have about 100 private member bills that are introduced. People get their 5 or 6 news coverage articles, and MPs are really happy. No one wants to actually create a movement that will actually, okay, let's do a cross-party whip. Let's make sure we're getting the ruling government involved, the opposition involved. No, the answer is just a private members bill, because they know that they'll get that dividend off, oh yeah, he stands for the youth. And I won't name, but a few MPs that you have heard of thoroughly have all actually tried to push a private members bill in both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and we're like, no, that doesn't solve the purpose. So I think I think that's a big issue. And also, of course, we are a little bit more ageist and we are a little bit more restrictive in that way culturally than I would say any of the Western counterparts, for sure.
To cap off that discussion on ageism, I think Sudhanshu's book is full of some of these statistics that will make you look back and be like, wow. So India's had the Ministry for Youth Development for a couple of decades now. And Sudhanshu has a table of all the ministers who've occupied that position. I think the lowest was 36 years of age, which was Mamata Banerjee back in the 1980s. I think she was.
And that was a mistake, by the way. Not a mistake in terms of it, but she accidentally became a youth affairs minister. They didn't realize that she was, which is a whole other story, by the way.
And one of the points he makes is that one of the ministers was actually 79 when he became the Minister for Youth Development, and I think also was probably the same minister who passed away while in office.
82 years old.
Yeah, so that's one of the points he makes. The second one around the ages of the people who are heading the youth divisions of each of the political parties. And I think that maxes out at 55. So there's a political party where the head of the youth wing of the party is actually 55 years old. So a lot of these statistics, again, that you can find in Sudhanshu's book. But another interesting aspect that I want to speak about, and of course, please do feel free to raise your hand in case you have any questions. Sorry, the gentleman there.
Excuse me, sir.
Just wait, we'll just get you the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, you can hear me, right? So, the question is, did you come across any data which also overlapped religion and the age and the political situation altogether?
So when you say religion, in what context are you talking about? Like, are they religious / are they
Yes,
political,
because
or are they voting on religious beliefs and ideas, etc.?
Yeah, see, right now it can be pretty apparent that when you choose or elect someone or vote for someone, you're also sort of choosing a side religiously. Like there is a underlying statement, even if no one stands up and says it out in the crowd, there is that statement. So is there any hesitation from the youth to sort of stand out and very starkly vote for someone? Like it's not just voting for what should happen or what should not happen. It's also a religious stance that youth would take when they sort of vote. So I'm just curious to see if there is any overlap of this situation and there is some hesitation from youth maybe in terms of taking stance religiously, which is an underlying thing when it comes down to voting.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a very long-winded answer to that, which will probably not answer your question, but still. This book isn't something that's exploring the political opinions and kind of, and then, you reading it. I'm not here to answer, do young people vote for this certain candidate over the other? Do young people, vote for this development issue or this religious issue? I want to clarify that, right? That's not something that I set out to do because I think there's a lot of surveys, et cetera, that are happening that are trying to kind of explore it. And, the merits of those surveys are up to discussion and grabs, but that, right? The second aspect was there was already a lot of, and beautiful works, right? Of kind of conversations and books that kind of what you're talking about. Have you heard of H-pop? Kunal Purohit just came out with this book where it's, I'm not a journalist, right? So I can't write this kind of like anthropological like kind of perspective of following these narratives. And they're not really characters in my book, right? They're kind of instances and anecdotes of making the larger point, but I'm not like following characters. And why I say that is I wanted to write a book that was kind of like an end-all be-all of young people and their politics in general. I was sick and tired of coming out with these books talking about youth politicians when the politician they're interviewing is 52 years old. His kid is my age. And I was like, what? And that is something that, and this is not, out of the ordinary. That's the norm. Whether it's a book, whether it's an interview, and everyone is culpable to this, right? And we were talking about, are we a little bit more kind of ageist? I mean, we are very kind of, in that perspective, and media is to blame for this single-handedly, is we give all these middle-aged men and elderly men this hall pass when it comes to age, right? Just because they have a baby face doesn't mean you're actually young. Like in that way, you are from a different generation. So I do think about, and I kind of covered this right now, is that in the book in itself, there is a section about sociocultural religious leaders that are young. So I have profiled two that are 28 years old and 26 years old. And one of them you probably have heard of a lot, Bageshwar Dham, right? And I had an instance to kind of meet them, and if not, he was basically the most sought out religious kind of like Baba during the 5 state elections, like all the CMs. It's another story that any CM candidate that tried to meet Bageshwar Dham and met him didn't eventually become CM, which is kind of funny. I explore a little bit about why and the identities of why we're kind of exploring religion and young people and what are they thinking about, right? I don't have first of all, like statistics on the overlap of religion and their political preferences. You won't find that. But what you will find are young people and anecdotes, but also kind of like narratives of how these young people that you expect to be on their phones, I don't know, trading stocks or looking at Bollywood news or Sandalwood news, but instead are literally absorbed into this kind of, let's say, religious propaganda in some cases, or other propaganda in that way. So it's very interesting. And it's both, it's not just one certain religion, right? That's also something that I kind of explored, is multitudes of religions, including, minority religions that were kind of in the news in the past year and a half, but also exploring that side as well. So, sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's not that I have like actual data of that correlation.
If I could add to that, I think while I was doing research for my own book, CSDS does a bunch of surveys which get into the youth demographic with a lot of detail. There's also MyGov, YouTube, CPR have also done a bunch of surveys. So as he rightly said, that there are a bunch of surveys that you will be able to find where they'll talk about the kind of political preferences and of the youth and how they intersect with their kind of social and political behaviors as well. But I think, was there a question back there as well? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Sudhanshu, for that very interesting presentation, and looking forward to the book, reading the book. I'm very curious to know, how do you exactly go about empowering these young, say, political leaders, right, through your organization, the Young India Foundation. So could you just maybe take me through what are some of the ways you identify, such political talent? How do you attract them? How do you empower them to sort of like, raise their profile, public persona, and then also resources, which are very important in political campaigns? So could you just take us through maybe the work that you do at the Young India Foundation?
Yes, so I will do that, but before that, I don't think it's just limited to Young India Foundation. I think that was also a very, very big motivating factor for me to write the book. Because one of the biggest issues is that there's a lack of awareness. We do not, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, I look at politics through the perspective of age. I don't look at it through the perspective of religion, ideology, etc. And I know there are there's a lot of critiques to that, which I completely abide by, but I still am fascinated by that, right? So one of the biggest motivating factors was to bring awareness about what is a political dynamic when it comes to age, right? And as you were kind of briefing into, and there's like literally, I made it as simple as possible, because it was shocking to me that, we don't even think or know. I had to, in one instance, for example, the youth affairs minister of a certain state, it wasn't even on the website. Like a certain state, I'm not going to claim out the names, there was not even like on that, the minister was not listed. So I had to call the secretariat up, right, and find out who the minister was from the youth development department of that respective state. And they're like, and it's a Hindi speaking state, it's like, wo sir honge, wahan pe honge. And then you had to check with the PA to cross check, right? That is the lack of awareness, and it turned out to be a 65-year-old, regardless. And that's kind of the average age, by the way. So, and there was a brief thing, even when it comes to these youth wings. Forget youth wings, the student wing leaders in some parties are 40 and 35. And no one's talking about this. 35 and 40 for just the student wing. And it's not even these, very small Aam Aadmi parties, right? That's a very, very, in a way, so I'm not going to label term them, but Aam Aadmi Party is pretty famous. They're pretty, out there, social media savvy. Their student wing leader was 36 years old. Student, not even youth in that way. And you look at all these different parties, and it's just not, I'm not just calling out the Aam Aadmi Party for it, and then the youth wings even get older, right? One of the current main opposition parties, their youth wing head is has kids that are 21, 22 years old, right? So just estimate how much their age would be, around 50. So first of all, I think that was one of the biggest things I wanted to do as a motivating factor is people need to think about politics and our politicians from the perspective of age. And I think that we will then be a little bit more mindful in that way. And if not mindful in terms of how we're voting, because I don't want people to be single issue voters, but at least make sure that awareness rises, that the Youth Development Ministry is not just like a ministry on its side, right, that no one's paying attention to, even though unfortunately it is the least, and that's something that I focus on, the least kind of budgeted ministry in the entire government. Then in terms of Young India Foundation, what we're trying to do is, one of the biggest things is voting, making sure people are actually getting out to vote. We've teamed up with the Election Commission. But when we first started, which was really interesting, is I started Young India Foundation because we wanted to do a PIL to the Supreme Court and ask, and this was in 2017, why the age was 25 and 30. And so we took the PIL and it was thrown out because, quite simply, Supreme Court said that they had no jurisdiction over this. This is a legislative issue. You will have to bring an amendment to the Representations of Peoples Act. We can't do anything. Fair enough. But we, from there, decided that we were going to bring awareness to it. So I remember we started doing workshops. And this is kind of the onset of what we were trying to do. And we went to kind of rural India, right? But I went to Haryana and a small town near Kurukshetra, Pai, and it actually doesn't even have, at this point, it just got a senior secondary school. There's very limited colleges, forget, really higher education in that way. But it has about 12,000 voters. And so it's a very big village comparatively. And I was doing a kind of like a lecture there in my broken Haryanavi, say what you will with that. But this person comes up, his name was Jagbir Kumar, and he was like, "Bhashan to sahi de lete ho, mera kya kar sakte ho?" Right? Like, you can give a good lecture, but what can you really do for me? And he's like, "I don't need to be told that we should be in politics, that we should be, representing, we should be doing this. But my community, my village, my samaj won't allow me because of my age." And that's where we really realized that there are restrictions that come in the way of young people contesting. So just, really quick story short, what we try to do is we find people between the ages of 21 and 25 all across India, and we help them contest at the panchayati level. So Sarpanch, Jila Parishad, panchayati levels, and for free. We work on their campaigns. We get volunteers from all across the country, everything from their campaign songs and campaign jingles to their booth management. We send volunteers out there, all for free, to ensure that, hey, maybe you could have like an easy time. So things that, for example, we faced. One of the biggest issues, and this is something that comes back to the book, and one of the things I talk about is if you decrease the age, more young people will contest. People will be like, no, they won't. Look at how many people are actually contesting regardless of winning. But the thing is that there's so much discrimination when it even comes to your nomination paperwork, right? Forget the data that's thrown out. In my own kind of experience, we have overall helped 52 candidates contest elections at a panchayati Jila Parishad level, out of whom 26 have won. But that number would have been easily above 80, except their nomination paperwork was thrown out for the most absurd reasons. So for example, in Gurgaon, forget rural India. In Gurgaon in 2016, we decided to make sure that we had one young female candidate who had come back from Canada to study, help her, and I still remember, help her contest elections. And this was 2016, in Gurgaon proper, not even like in the villages. And she couldn't get her nomination paperwork because the DC, the educated DC of that time, threw out her nomination paperwork because he had decided that one other restriction, and at that time there was a big push for Swachh Bharat, etc., that every single candidate will need to have a toilet in their home because that was the big thing, having toilets, etc. And she didn't take, and the way, DC Saab wouldn't go check if the person had a toilet in their home, the candidates. So he had required a selfie with a toilet as a nomination form paperwork that you had to attach. Imagine how ridiculous that is. And her form was thrown out because she didn't have a selfie with a toilet. I'm not making this up. This happens, and it still will happen in some form. And so we realize that even in nomination paperwork, right, we send our lawyers there to make sure that none of this actually happens. But so many young people do not have an equal level playing ground. Forget even the cost of election candidates. You can't even get on the EVM itself. And so that's what we help out in, and that's one thing that we're going for. Our only two criterias is that you contest independently, and that you're between the ages of 21 and 25. We look at no other lens. Impressively, out of the 52 candidates that actually got in the EVMs, 32 were women, a majority of them. And that's not something that we tried to do, it's just that they were really good candidates in that way. But yeah, so that's something that we try to empower directly through a Young India Foundation perspective.
I know there are a bunch of questions. If I could pick up one theme and then open up again for audience Q&A. There's a substantial part of the book, Sudhanshu, that you speak about really the context and the history behind the voting age and the age of contesting. One of the things that really struck me was the Constituent Assembly debates on this topic, or the lack thereof, or at least how you pointed out, and my summary for the audience in today's lingo would be basically they hadn't thought about it. At the last moment, someone says, okay, let's go with 25 and 35. 25 for the Lok Sabha, 35 for the Rajya Sabha. Some people protest, move an amendment that the 35 should become 30, make speeches. Ambedkar rises up, says, look, I don't care, that's fine. And so this notion that the Constituent Assembly itself perhaps did not spend as much time thinking about this, or even if it did, it was kind of ad hoc and very unstructured. Can you give us a little bit more of that kind of context and history? What was the Constituent Assembly thinking in first proposing 25 and 35 and then settling on 25 and 30?
Yeah, I honestly really, really appreciate you asking that, because I think those two chapters, the Constituent Assembly debates that took place on age for the candidacy age, as well as then the conversations that took place in the 61st Amendment, they do really good things. They showcase that ageism that I talk about, and they showcase, the lack of interest and thought that was put into it. And sure, I get it. There are many, many issues that they were also discussing. I'm not discounting that. But the sheer reality is, and the data and the proof that we have, the archives that we have, and unfortunately, since 47, no one has really written about the age of candidacy and what was discussed. Never. Ornich and I had this fantastic kind of how India became democratic and looks through all the Constituent Assembly debates, and even that's the most exhaustive kind of book that's been written, mentions age and only the age of voting once. After that, before that, academics have not discussed this. And that's something that, I wanted this book to be very accessible. I wanted tier 2, tier 3 people to be reading it, to be talking about it, grasp. But those are two chapters that are kind of like a little bit meaty. There are just a lot of conversations back and forth, because I understood that no one else had done this, and I don't think anyone else is going to do this again, because it's not something that comes up, right? It's also really hard, again, to get these archives and to understand what they were saying. I had to fly to the UK to even get, because even in our parliament, they don't have that section when they discuss the ages, 20, 30 pages are missing, and I had to actually go to the UK to get that access, right? And you're absolutely right. There was very little effort put into kind of discussion. Now, if you think about the discussions that happen in Western countries as they're thinking about decreasing the age from the 50s onwards, the first country did it so in the 1912s, 1920s, there's a lot of thought process put in. But when it comes to India, you're right. I mean, B.R. Ambedkar was so passionate about so many things, and rightfully so. And it's really interesting because he himself, at the age of 25, was nominated as Bombay Legislative Council, or he wouldn't have been if the rules that he was propagating, he also wouldn't have been eligible at the time, which is really funny in that way. And if it wasn't for, this very one young female freedom fighter who got up last minute and said, I don't get this. I wouldn't be sitting in this hall if you have the ages right now, right? What is the rationale? And some person says, literally one politician says, I don't think my niece is 25. I don't think she's mature enough to vote or contest. He says that in the Constituent Assembly debates. That was the rhetoric. And then that got me interested as, okay, so we have just lifted the ages of the age of candidacy from the UK. Where did the UK get them from? And this is something really interesting I found out in this, is that, the UK also had, at that time was 25 and 30, and then they decreased it to 23, then 21, then 18, and now they're finally decreasing it or thinking of decreasing it to 16, at which age you can to vote and contest as well. But they got the age of 25 and 30 because in the medieval times, what was said is when you became a knighthood, when you got knighthood, when you became a knight, your body was strong enough to carry the armor of the, I think at that time, the 300, 400 seal that you would be carrying. So at that time, they were like, if you can then, carry that armor, right, you can be a knight, then you can contest in the House of Commons and etc. and that sort of stuff. So that's where they got their age of candidacy from. It's no scientific rationale. It's no experienced enough, immature enough, whatever it is. It's literally, at that time, someone was like, I can, the knighthood, that means it, and then they used it, and then India just took it on as their own. And I think that was super alarming that this hasn't been discussed, and it's not being discussed enough. So when I advocate for, the age of reduction candidacy, as I was talking about, and I know I swiftly went through it, I'll get a lot of answers of, experience, immaturity. All these things have come up post the Constituent Assembly. Right? And these are the same things in debates and discussions that occurred in 1980s when Rajiv Gandhi and the opposition were working together to decrease the age at which you could vote. And the same questions and restraints were there. People saying, I know people in my constituency that would never, should be allowed to vote at 18. What about studying? People were saying that, if they are allowed to vote at 18, they'll stop their education. These very irrational things, the kind of fear-mongering that happens, by the way, there's a very strong similarity of when the discussion of the age of candidacy to come down that we talk about now is very similar when what happens in 1988 and 89. The second thing I want to really reflect on is something that I grew up with. When I was first doing these discussions, I was told through narratives, through etc., that Rajiv Gandhi ushered in the youth rights movement. He can take credit for that because he brought the 61st Amendment. That's what I believed. That is what I went on public stage talking about, etc. But in the process of writing this book, I realized something. Rajiv Gandhi sat on this bill for 4 years. He didn't want to bring it in. It was because of the regional leaders, and the Bharatiya Janata Sangh, by the way, at that time, L.K. Advani, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, but strongly the regional leaders, MGR. Then you had, at that time, I think Dev Gowda did play a little part, but still a very big part in that way. And then you also had Devi Lal from Haryana. And then you had basically from Andhra Pradesh, undivided Andhra Pradesh, and then Tamil Nadu, right? These people got together and were like, it doesn't make sense. First of all, the government's sitting on it. In fact, by the way, in Parliament, Rajiv Gandhi introduces the bill. His youth affairs minister introduces the bill. West Bengal gets tired, and Tamil Nadu gets tired, and Karnataka gets tired of them just sitting on the bill. So they enact it at a local level. Like I said, Karnataka started it. The legal law affairs minister in the union government belonged from West Bengal, is from the Congress party, sues the Communist Party in West Bengal, then sues MGR and their government in Tamil Nadu for introducing the bill and decreasing the age, and said this is not right. That hypocrisy is something that I was not aware of. In fact, there were at least 110 protests that the South Indian states did collectively in the course of 1 year to influence and make this bill move forward. And I thought that history had been also lost because all the credit is kind of whitewashed in that way. And I wanted to make sure that people are, know this as well. And that's something that I reflected on.
Great, thank you so much. And my last question on this kind of topic of political representation and age is, while you obviously make a very strong case for reducing the age of contesting, perhaps bringing it down to 18 as well, one of the reflections I had while researching my own book was that unfortunately MPs and MLAs in India have become disempowered to a great extent because of the anti-defection law and a whole bunch of other things. The real political power in India resides in political parties, not in kind of legislatures, unfortunately, as much. Political parties are outside the realm of operate outside the realm of the constitution, were in fact not even mentioned in the original constitution. Now, political parties don't necessarily have these kind of age, I believe, or I suppose, these kind of restrictions on age of contesting, etc. But yet we have that situation where, for example, the president of the largest opposition party is an 80-year-old gentleman. Similarly, across party lines in the BJD, in the Trinamool Congress, or take any political party, you're again talking 60 plus, if not 70 or 80 plus. What prevents youth leaders from emerging in these political parties, especially given that we see the context of a lot of kind of student political leaders eventually entering politics and occupying its highest positions? But why do we see the heads of these political parties or decision makers within these political parties actually be far older and less representation for the youth?
I mean, clear ageism. And I think you see this. And in fact, this is kind of a yin and yang situation, because I was in a room where someone from one of the main opposition parties didn't get a position they wanted. And the person, the national general secretary at that time, told this young person, even though they had committed hours, they had really been completely, full-on advocates of the party, etc. Abhi to umar bhi kya hai? Chunav to lad nahi sakte. What's your age? You can't even contest an election. You have time. So do you see, like, they use this, and that's why I call it as almost like a noose around young people's neck in that way, is that it's just an excuse, right? I'm not advocating turning parliament into a daycare. I've never advocated for quotas and reservations. I've also never said that there should be a reservation, basically a retirement age. I've never said that either, because I genuinely do not believe that, one identity and their success comes at the expense of the other identity in an ideal world. And so, these are things when there's specifically a legal restriction, what ends up happening is that they have this excuse. Chunav bhi nahi lad sakte. You can't even contest elections. And I've seen this multiple times. And in fact, I profiled one young candidate, and not even a candidate, he basically won the Rajasthan student elections, Rajasthan University, Nirmal Chaudhary. The CM at that time, before the November elections, is calling Nirmal Chaudhary, who is 23 years old, to his rallies because the CM is not getting people, right? But Nirmal Chaudhary can bring an entire crowd. Tens of thousands of people, easily one of the most recognizable faces, but cannot contest elections because he's 23 years old. And one of the things he says, and I asked him, what party are you thinking? And he is, he contested as an independent because he didn't get a ticket. The ticket went to some other politician's son or this or that. And, but he was very clear that, to have a political life, you need to join a political party. This independent route will bankrupt me, etc., whatever. But what he was realizing, he said this in like very crude terms, and I don't know if I can use those terms, but he was like, they're sucking the life out of me. They're using me. And he said this word, nichodna, but in a very Rajasthani dialect, and saying that, I know they're using me, they are taking everything, but what other option do I have? And so it's this kind of conundrum where the political party then says, you can't be doing this or whatever because your age is not there, and still doing it. Now, just one thing on that though, in the 2024 elections, there is a clear distinction, maybe not inter-party in that way, but when it comes to the youth voter outreach, what I've seen is that, and specifically I'm going to talk about the government in power right now, specifically Narendra Modi, whether it's the memes that they're using, I don't know if you've seen just Instagram being flooded, whether it's the specific outreach that they're doing in their campaigning, it's all very curated to a youth demographic. So when National Voters Day arrived, Narendra Modi launched a Namo Data kind of scheme and specifically did this pan-India event on just first-time voters. When the parliament speech happened, kind of like the motion to speak and everything was happening, he was using Gen Z language. He used the word cancel culture and woke and like all these like terminologies and basically talked about it. And then on February 18th, the BJP had a convention in Delhi. They brought all their national conventions. And the first 10 minutes, Narendra Modi started off with, on February 18th, I'm fortunate to have the support, etc. But we are looking for the 18-year-olds who will elect the 18th Lok Sabha. That wasn't a youth-centric campaign. That was a national BJP campaign. And if you've heard a lot of discussions about how the BJP, and look, I'm using this example because I'm studying them, I'm seeing the most outwardly kind of focus. But there are about 4 or 5 different schemes that the BJP is doing pan-India that kind of are trying to reach out to voters, trying to talk about what the government has done. 2 of them that I see, and one of them specifically is the women outreach, and then the youth outreach. And it's the Namo Data that has actually been starting for a very long time, but really been profiled and kind of picking up steam now, is that they are making it a plank issue. It's not unemployment that they're talking about. It's not, youth issues manifestos. They are directly going out to these young people and saying, I am asking for your vote. I'm not asking for your father's vote. I'm not asking your father to vote, I am asking for your vote. And I think there's a rationale to that. And sorry, I'm just like blabbering on, but this is very interesting because the parties themselves are changing how their outreach. I think why is because they've realized that in the past 10 years, and it's kind of like counterintuitive, right? This is the demographic that has grown up with Narendra Modi as prime minister. They haven't seen what was before. And I think it's so fascinating that, they're still doing that outreach even though they should technically, if you think about just anti-incumbency or whatever it may be, they should be in the back foot, right? Technically, at this time, Congress was just gone in that aspect, right? When you think about 2013, 2014, early on. Here, they have a front foot where they're saying, I know you've grown up with me, but I'm still going to ask for your vote, and I'm going to directly ask for it. And do these Gen Z techniques and campaigns and directly outreach to you, which, the opposition should be doing this. And they're not. Like, dude uploads a YouTube video, great, right? But is it a specifically curated youth campaign? No one other than Narendra Modi is doing it. Unless, please prove me wrong in that way. But I'm obsessed with this. I really am in that way. And I'm just like, this is fascinating. And so I think that if, let's say, you're able to expand the youth vote bank, because it's the vote bank that you don't have to take away from a different party. Like I said, 210 million people, 21.5 crore young voters between 18 and 30 who have, and the 9 crore or 90 million people who have never voted. That's a fresh vote bank that you're adding on, right? And that's what they're trying to put into their kind of caveat. So when they say these numbers, whether it's 370 or 400, I think what they're thinking about is getting the people who have never been part of the process. And you see this in a lot of campaigns. So Barack Obama, in kind of like post-1980s, 1990s, he won by far the most. Kind of electoral college votes and popular vote. And one of the things that people say is that he was able to bring in a large coalition of voters that had never voted before. And I think what Prime Minister Modi is doing right now is along the similar lines, that he's done it in a way and form, but in this election, for the 3rd term, he's actually focusing on young people. And just to end things here, I think because he's doing that, I would hope that he pays service and makes sure that the party itself then becomes more representative of young people as well. I mean, that's something that if the youth vote bank will come out vote for you and you're attributing your success to the youth vote, then you make the party and the government more representative.
On that note, we'll take another few questions here. Gentlemen up front.
Thanks, Sudhanshu. Really very insightful. On this number, 25, 30, 18, 16, does the number really matter? Or, I mean, Greta Thunberg comes up and, the amount, and today everybody's talking climate. She was talking 10 years, 20 years, 15 years back or something. So do you have any thoughts on, do you need to have a number or anybody competent can come in? And then this number plays out in various aspects of society, from laws to all of that. So if you have any thoughts.
I think for the appropriate implementation of law and policy, that age, that number is important. I would say no, technically. But what is the inverse, right? And this is something that I discuss in the book, right? We love using the word millennial, right, towards just describing a large base. But when it comes to India, those age brackets don't really fit, right? If you just refer to anyone as young, and now thankfully we're using Gen Z, etc. But our demographics are such that it's so inflated when it comes from the bracket of 10 years old to 29. Like the numbers are just huge. And then there's a sharp decrease from below, not as sharp, and then a much sharper decrease when it comes to, the 35-year-olds and lower in that way, right? So when people are making policies, when let's say, for example, a UNDP comes out with a kind of youth policy and they want to and they do focus a lot on youth skill building in India. What is a youth? The UN defines it as 15 and 24. They are very strict that they will only skill develop or they'll only do their activities, etc., from anywhere between the ages of 15 and 24. If not, you can go to kind of the Child and Development Fund, etc., for anyone below the age of 15, for anyone above, whatever. But the Indian government's like, no. Our age is 15 and 29, so you also have to provide services to the 25 to 29 years old, right? And what that does is when it's, especially because now the UN is working a lot as consultants, et cetera, to a lot of these ministries, especially in the Northeast, et cetera. That's one of the biggest things that I've seen when I've talked to them, is that there's a policy mismatch. When, you're talking about prescribing policies for young people, youth specifically, right? Whether it's skill building, whether it's whatever it may be, you're not attracting the right people, because the people that are coming to the actual, like, let's say, events or et cetera that they've called is a 34-year-old. In reality, this is what's happening, and that's not who they're appealing to. That's not what the policy or what was meant for, or there's a mismatch in that. So I think when you think about it from a legal policy perspective, that age definitely matters. Ideally, I would like to say no. You can have young people, this and that, etc. But what ends up happening, that was the policy's perspective, but then media, right? You refer a 52-year-old as young because, again, they have a baby face, right? Next gen leader. I mean, I literally, there have been 4 books that came out of before this book about just interviewing next gen politicians. And they're still interviewing Shashi Tharoor. I mean, I'm sorry to call him out. I mean, I can call out 9 other politicians from all parties, but that's not viable. Those are not next-gen politicians in that way. Have some sort of, respect in that aspect. And this is the issue, right? They grew up in a different time. They grew up in a different generation. They're not the people that understand the issues of what a 19-year-old does and goes through right now. And that, has been proven everywhere. You wouldn't expect, a women reservations panel bill to be highlighted and talked about by all men, right? We call that out. Why aren't we calling this out in that way?
So there's been a question there waiting, I think, for a while. Please go ahead.
Oh, that was a wonderful presentation, sir. Some facts were really mind-blowing. Thank you for bringing it up. So I wanted to ask, when you say more youth should be part of political processes, do you mean the participation side or the representative side? Because when it comes to participation side, already there are registered voters in large number, and some of them also become part of IT cells of these political parties, okay? But they don't make their decisions very objectively. They are told what their choices should be. And they are the content creators for our Gen Zs on social media. And they exactly know how to tackle our youth, through memes or whatever, catching up to the trend. So what do you think about this trend? And one more thing I wanted to ask is that our role of our education system, and why is it not successful in building youth leaders? Because age also should come with that evolved level of thinking and maturity. Do you think our education system is lagging behind in preparing such leaders?
So to your first question, I think that's a very fascinating question, because I also deal with that and struggle with that. Is it enough? What form of participation are young people doing? Is it just, are you okay with just the voting turnout, or do you want them, actually contesting? Do you want them, whether it's just out on the streets or formal participation? I don't mind going on record and saying this, that there is a clear distinction between pre and post 2014 when it comes to young people across the government and their engagement with it. By far, and I have noticed this pre-2014 and obviously now, you have substantially more younger people. And in fact, in 2013, I think Prime Minister Modi started this off, that he started his rally or his election campaign not at like a rally, not even at a Yodha, etc. He started it at SRCC. I don't know if you remember that, but he came in and he started talking about, you know, he went to SRCC and started the election rally, and he said this very big quote, and I talk about this, is that, you know, what's the secret sauce for, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't think he would use secret sauce, maybe now he'll use that word because he's appealing to the Gen Z. You know, what's the secret sauce for India? And, you know, he says that Europe buddha ho chuka hai, America buddha ho chuka hai, but India youth hai, you know, that is the whatever. And he talked a lot about empowering them. Not giving them employment, not doing the voter rhetoric. In that speech, he talked a lot about empowering them. Now, one thing is that post-2014, I can go to a minister's office and there is a very strong chance that I will see a 21, 22-year-old APS at that office. I will see, you know, dozens of APSs or secretariats in the Lok Sabha. You see more young people visibly, fresh out of the, you know, like college, university, etc., that are working with ministries, which was not, by the way, something that was pre-2014. But then my question is that some people being closer to power, is that a substitute for the empowerment of young people in general? Because that has been kind of the thing. It's, you know, we have people that are much closer to power, that chambers, etc., but have we truly empowered them? Because we haven't had a bill. Whether it talked about voting, whether it talked about, you know, even employment, or whether it talks about age of candidacy, which, you know, I expected there to be, that came out. So, you know, I'm in that form where it's, you know, where do you say? Now, if you're talking about data, I will say, and credit where it's due, a BJP MP is 5 years younger than the opposition party's MP. The oldest MP in Congress is 81, in all of the opposition is 92. The oldest in the BJP, again, now is 75 in that way. So it's really hard to not look at that. Now, at the inverse, you can say, but that doesn't mean much when young people are being oppressed, young people don't have voices. I'm not disagreeing with that. But as an analyst that tries to be as objective, you have this reality and you also have that reality. And when it comes to just the rhetoric, I think, I haven't seen so much focus being given towards young people. I don't know if you remember, a lot of you probably noticed the 2009, 2012 campaigns for UP, etc. The youth voter outreach in 2012 or 2015 was, I wear jeans. That was I'm not kidding. That was what media was fascinated about, that in 2009, someone was wearing jeans and a kurta, right? Or in 2012, someone was carrying an iPad. So then he was new age, he was modern, and these sort of things. And so I'm glad that our campaigning, our outreach has developed that goes beyond these very superficial things. We're taking these considerations where we have data to prove, okay, has it gotten younger? But again, does that mean that young people have been empowered? I don't think so in that way.
All right, this discussion could clearly go on for a long time, but we have 5 minutes left. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then you can answer them in any order you'd like. Please go ahead. If you could pass the mic there.
Hi, my name is Sharanya and I'm a psychology and journalism student, and I'm here with my friend and I'm really happy to be here. Give me a second. Yes. You mentioned that there are systemic barriers that don't allow the youth population to vote. But because these are systemic barriers, and it's hard to make these systemic changes if you aren't in power or if you don't have representatives who are in power. From your experience, how do you think we can make a change that is sustainable, that is long-lasting, and that is effective?
Great. If you could take a couple of other questions, I think there was one there. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that youth, in the places where they're allowed to do come out and make an impact or discuss and things. And I was just curious, in all of your research, did you come across this idea of the relationship that youth have with power? Especially as middle-class Indians, I mean, a lot of times you do things despite the government, right? And you kind of get used to it because you don't really get any benefits despite paying the taxes. And that's also sometimes the attitude of the youth, like you go on, you do your startup, you do your job, and you kind of carry on despite the government. So I was very curious to know if you've gotten into the, the youth-centric view to the idea of power, and does it skew more towards decentralized power, volunteering, because you do turn up for volunteering, climate change, lake rejuvenation, all that is not seen through the lens of political power, but it is. So just very curious to know that.
Why don't you answer that, and we'll take a final two questions.
Yeah, so I think actually that is a fascinating question. And I think one of the answers that I tried to answer in this book, but also have explored, is it's a lack of accessibility. I'm still confused as to why you all have DigiLocker, or DigiWallet, whatever it's called at this point. There's so many digis. I can have my Aadhaar, my PAN, my driver's license, and you name it in that. The only thing I can't have is my voter ID card. Right? And neither, if I want to apply for a driver's license, I can use DigiLocker to use my digital wallet. I can go enter an airport and board a flight at this point without ever having to take out my wallet or any of my identification and using my biometric face. And yet, if I need to even register to vote, I cannot do it without a proper identification in hand, in person, that is also duly signed and notified, like self-attested. Like, how do you even self-attest in this age, in that aspect, right? So these very simple things that in the West, if I want a driver's license, I just have to check my box and say, oh, I want to register to vote as well. It's that easy to vote, right? In the UK, as an Indian citizen, I can vote on Brexit, right? Being a student, not even being a resident there, but an Indian citizen being a student can vote on Brexit to local municipality issues all the way. And being a student here, most students can't vote in that way. I think that's an accessibility issue. I think first and foremost, it gets in the way. And so when you're talking about the middle class and it being so far, of course, I mean, those are these things. But, when things are there for us, we obviously engage and interact more. I mean, you're still having to pay taxes. I mean, GST is all in our faces. We still have to do it, whatever we're doing, whether you're a startup or, an employee, whatever it is, right? It's there. Why isn't voting more accessible? So I think, I don't blame young people for it. I blame the system. I don't even blame a political party. It's the system in itself which prevents you. I blame the political parties for preventing and focusing on the youth vote, because I don't think it would go in their favors. In fact, I think 2024 is different, because for the first time you're actually focusing on the youth vote. And I believe that if they're going to focus on it, again, hopefully young people will get more engaged, interactive. We'll have reform in our voting process where it will be made more accessible.
We'll take last two questions because we're already out of time. Please go ahead.
Hello. Yeah. So I have one comment and two questions. Please don't call people in early 30s old. You've been referring to youth as only being people between 21 and 25. We are also young. And the questions that I have is, the argument that we have, I completely believe and support that to reduce the age, but there is there can be this argument, which is just because there are more in number, we want that representation. So do we also extend it to children? Let's suppose in a country there are many 4-year-olds, so will we have them? So where and how do we draw the line? And my second question is, we have already got a very good overview of your book. Why should we still buy it?
That's a great question. But sorry, ma'am, you had a question for some time.
Ma'am, just the mic, please. I don't know if I need it. Hi, that was very informative, and I'm an educator. And it didn't shock me, where India is on the indices so low. I think a lot will improve when we raise our nutrition levels. There's equity. You won't need a prime minister to address the youth. They'll be independent-minded. they'll be more media literate. And I think that is where our politicians and the powers that are need to focus. Everything will fall into place, a lot at least. I don't think we can afford to ignore the fact that we are on our way to being a world power and we are so low on the indices. That's my comment.
You know, that reminded me because the education question also came up previously. Yeah. And this is going to be really controversial, but I'm going to say it. I have 4 degrees. I'm working on my 5th degree. And I can tell you right now, I would make a terrible political representative in any forms of panchayat, sarpanch, assembly, whatever. But Jagbir Kumar, who was the first candidate that I was talking about initially from Pai, Haryana, graduated from 8th class, right? And right now is the reason that, I know.
I'm not talking about, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
There are always people who are outliers.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying the standard.
Absolutely, yeah. And just, but I do feel very strongly for this, but I know exactly what you're saying, and I just still really feel strongly about this, is that I realize, and maybe I'm wrong in this way, that education necessarily isn't the criteria at which you can become a good or bad political representative. I have seen many, many young people who did not have access to education, even today, right, that they had to because of some different forms, work, home, income, etc. But regardless of how far they were educated, they are incredibly great political representatives. Because, look, if I go back to my home state of Haryana, and my home village, which is middle of nowhere, I don't know pani ki nikasi ki kahan dikkat hai, but Jagbir Kumar, who's about 25-30 kilometers, knows exactly, and is that in fact he's the reason this 8th grade pass out that Pai Haryana got Wi-Fi for the first time because he was able to bring it about. And in fact, the sarpanch before him was an LLB graduate, 65, 70-year-old, but wasn't ever able to actually implement those things. So I understand what you were also saying, but I sometimes when we get into this discussion of education and how it should be, so many smart politicians have been and very well educated in India. They've also been the most corrupt.
Sorry, I'll have to cut that discussion here just because we're out of time. If you could answer that question.
Absolutely. So one thing is the 4-year-old. I think that in the different ages that I said. So first of all, I'm not saying you're old. Right? I'm very specifically saying that a youth definition, and I do that because, I'm a very big advocate for it. So I say, okay, the 15 to 24, the 15 to 29. Nowhere did I say, again, discriminating against old people, retire karo, ye karo, and obviously you're not old in that way. And I'm actually a very big advocate of intergenerational justice, right? In that way. So first, I think I say 29, or I use these ages because I understand the value of the legal definitions and how the implementation of that policy occurs, right? And also, these ages or the mischaracterization of these ages are often abused. And so, again, you have the 50-year-old being referred as young and youth. So I'm a big stickler to that, right? And that's because I work in this process. I'm a big proponent of it. Why should you buy the book? That's a really hard one. I wish I had the publishers here. One thing is that this is a one-stop all action of where, you'll learn and understand from the perspective of age. It's very easy to read. The second thing is basically, like all author royalties helps Young India Foundation. They're proceeded to the youth rights movement, so you'll be helping a lot of young candidates like Jagbir Kumar contest elections indirectly, so you get something out of it. And lastly, I think, I want to end by this, is Rabindranath Tagore, and I kind of end the book in this aspect, is Rabindranath Tagore has this quote where he says, the earth isn't the country beneath our feet, it's the people. And I think that to understand, we're always thinking about India's going to do this, India's going to be developed into this. It's only to do that when the people around us are developed, when they're progressing, when they're happy, when they're kind of contributing. And most of those young people are young, right? They're quite young. And so we can't develop at the expense of young people. That they have to go together as a country. So I think that we just need to think about that. And I think if you read the book, you'll have that perspective. Wow, that was a terrible pitch for the book, to be honest. Publishers are not going to be happy.
So clearly we can keep the discussion going, and I'm sure Sudhanshu will hang out for a while to keep it going. To answer your question about why buy the book, obviously you can imagine that I kind of want to put it out there that any kind of non-fiction book obviously takes years, right? So what we discussed today was really the tip of the iceberg. I think the book's so rich in data that if you guys want to have this conversation about the youth and young people in politics, this is kind of that arsenal of information that you can use. The second, even though I have read the book, I'm certainly going to buy a copy and get it signed, because it's always good to have an author signed copy. And the third reason is that I think even as kind of I was winding up my book in the last chapter, I write about how it's important to really start that dialogue. And Sudhanshu very powerfully argues that this lens that he's taken has not been taken before. So I think for us, all of us as readers, to kind of purchase the book, engage with it, promote it, get others to buy it, I think will become, and it's extremely timely, will become a catalyst to having this discussion a lot more. So Sudhanshu, thank you so much for writing this book. Thank you so much for coming down to Bangalore and having this conversation with us.
And thank you for pitching my book better than me.
And I'm sure you'll be around for the next few minutes to kind of answer more questions. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Sudhanshu and Subhashish, for being here.